It's time to chuck the chuck. No, I would not throw my chuck. That would not be a good way to take care of this instrument. Hi, I'm Kent and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. However, today we are not going to use this chuck while turning a bowl. We're not going to use it because we don't need to use it all the time. We can get away without using a four-jaw chuck to turn a beautiful bowl, and I'm going to show you how to do that. Now you might be thinking, well, why would you want to do that? Well, if you're first starting out turning and you're not quite sure if you want to turn bowls yet, buying a chuck can be an expensive investment and you might not use it. So this is a great technique that I'm going to share with you today to mount bowls to your lathe without using the four-jaw chuck. Instead, we're going to use a faceplate. Simple, old, regular faceplate. Now, most lathe manufacturers provide a faceplate with the lathe, so you should already have one of these. If you don't, they're relatively inexpensive. You could purchase one. We're going to use the faceplate and we're going to use the tailstock, and that's all you need to mount your bowl blank to the lathe to turn a bowl. So let me show you the steps of how to do this, and let's get started. I'm going to be turning a piece of poplar. And I want to make sure I've got the faceplate relatively centered here. This measurement isn't 100% necessary. We are going to need to take more accurate measurements in just a moment, but we want to center it up because if we don't, if we're off just say a quarter of an inch, that means we're going to lose a half inch from the diameter of this blank. So we want to center it up as much as possible. Now I'm looking straight down through the faceplate and lining up that center and just eyeing it up really, really closely there. Now this first screw, I'm not going to drive that all the way in. I'm just going to get that started. The reason why you don't want to do that is it will torque and twist the faceplate. Now I'm looking back through there and making sure that's centered up, and I'll drive the second screw through, and then I can go back and tighten up that first screw, and then I'll apply the rest of the screws. Now, a faceplate is a great way to attach a bowl blank, and it's actually very secure attachment. I have yet to have a blank come off the lathe or have any kind of issues when using a faceplate correctly. Now, the steps that I'm going to use to mount this bowl to the lathe without using a chuck are just one way to do this. There are numerous ways of which you could go about doing the same technique. Now this particular blank has a rough surface on both faces, so I really need to clean up those faces first before I try to glue a glue block or a waste block to this piece. And that's part of the reason why I'm using this technique. So I'm starting with the faceplate and I'm going to shape the base or the bottom of the bowl first. Very similar to what I do when I'm doing a turning using the four-jaw chuck. Things will get a little bit different in just a moment now. So I'm going to start curving off the bottom corner like I typically do when I'm turning a bowl. Start creating that shape. This is my 5/8 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. You can see the poplar turning, making some nice clean shavings there. Now I'm going to clean up the edge of this. There's a little bit of high and low spots. I'm going to clean that up. Notice how I'm pointing the nose of the bowl gouge in the direction of the cut all the time. And I'm not using my hands to move this. I'm shifting my body weight. I've got a class called Bowl Gouge Mastery, and you might want to check it out. If you're working with the bowl gouge and you're struggling a little bit, or if you're just curious about the bowl gouge and you're just starting out, or you're using a carbide scraper and you want to convert and start using a traditional bowl gouge, then check out my Bowl Gouge Mastery course. You're going to have everything you need to know there at your fingertips, lesson by lesson, and you'll learn very quickly how to master the bowl gouge. Okay, so very quickly here, I've got the face cleaned up and I have the side cleaned up. I'm going to make one more pass here to really clean up the face of this and make sure I've got a good flat surface, and then I'll check this as well. Notice my pace. My pace is not super fast here. I'm not trying to race. I want to make a clean, straight line. That's my focus. And the way you can check that is take your gouge and lay it up against the surface and see if it matches. Any low spots will be evident when you do that. All right, so I'm going to use my dividers. I've predetermined a size for the tenon that I'm going to turn on this. And I'm leaving the dividers fixed to that shape. And you'll see why in just a moment. So I'm going to turn away the material. Now, this looks very similar to what I do most of the time with my other bowls. But this tenon is going to be a straight tenon, a 90-degree straight-sided tenon, and not a dovetail tenon. It's very important to make a dovetail tenon when we're using the 4-jaw chucks. But in this case, we're not doing that. Instead, this tenon is going to be more of a traditional woodworking tenon. It needs to fit down into a recessed mortise, and we're going to make this 90-degree angle. I'm going to do that by using this flat scraper. This scraper's got a little bit of a corner that's taken out of it, so it's not perfectly sharp there. I'm going to need to address that. So what this is doing, this is giving me the 90-degree side on the tenon, and it's letting me flatten the bottom of this bowl to make sure that it's perfectly 90 degrees. And I need to scrape away a little bit of that material. Now that inside corner, I want to make sure this fits and seats really well, so I'm going to take my spindle detail gouge and I'm going to clean up that inside corner. Just remove a little bit of that material that's in there. And we're all straightened away. So now we've got the tenon established. I'm going to continue shaping the exterior of this bowl. One of the things that's really important, especially when you're first starting out, is, and it's kind of a little tricky to see here, I'm not moving my hands or arms. You're seeing them move here, but what's causing that movement is the shifting of my body weight. I have my body positioned between the beginning and the end of this pass, and I'm simply shifting my body weight. I'm using my hands to hold this down in position. Here you can see that a little bit better. I'm going to use the scraping cut to take off that high spot at the base of the bowl. What I want is I want a continuous flowing curve that goes from the bottom of the bowl up to the rim. Here I'm using the shear scrape. The shear scrape is a great way to merge areas together. If you haven't seen it, I got a video all on the shear scrape. You want to check that out. I'm going to use a scraping cut here to level out the rim so I have an idea where the rim is going to be. Again, this is just a rough cut blank, so I don't have a real clean top edge there until I just did that scraping cut. And I want this to be a slightly closed rim, meaning the rim is narrower than the widest point of the bowl. And that's going to give me this really nice flowing continuous curve from the rim down through the bottom up to the other side of the bowl. Now you can see that high spot in the middle. I'm going to scrape that away with a scraping cut. And again, I'm just shifting my body weight. And I'm watching the top edge of this bowl, just like you guys are seeing at the top there. You're seeing that shape change. Well, I'm doing the same thing. I'm looking across the top of the bowl and I'm watching and making sure that where I'm working is creating the transition that I want between those areas. And just take your time. Remember, you want the exterior of the bowl to be as close to perfect as possible, because the more time you spend on the exterior, the better your bowl will appear and the happier you'll be with the bowl, because essentially that's what everybody sees and that's what they touch is the exterior of the bowl. Okay, so this portion is done. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this blank off the lathe. I'm going to remove the faceplate. I had the chuck in my impact driver go bad and wasn't holding the bit, and I found a YouTube video on fixing that, and I'm happy to have that fixed now. It was kind of frustrating. Okay, so we have the bowl blank with the tenon. Now this is the faceplate. I want to show you these screws. These are woodworking screws. They're about the same diameter as the hole. That's important so they don't wiggle around. And there's about 7 threads exposed extending outside of the faceplate. That's really important. That 7 thread count is about the depth that you need to get a good hold on the piece you're turning. You don't want them to be shorter, and you don't need it to be longer than that. Okay, so this is going to be our sacrificial waste block. Now what I'm using here is a Forstner bit. I'm driving a Forstner bit into the center, or what will become the center of this bowl. And I'm going to use that Forstner bit as a guide to make sure that I'm really getting this centered up quite nicely. Now the Forstner bit doesn't fit perfectly in there, but it's really close, and I can see the equal space around the sides of the Forstner bit inside there. So I know that I've got that faceplate. The important part of the Forstner bit is having that mark in the center of this blank. We'll be using that mark later, and I'll show you how we use that. So I tightened that, and it actually torqued it. And so I loosened it up so I can move the faceplate around, make sure I'm centered up again, and then I'll drive in the second screw. When you drive one in, the torque of the screw hitting the faceplate twists it to the side, so it won't be centered up anymore. Okay, so now it's centered up, and I'm going to tighten that first screw, and then we'll go ahead and apply the rest of these. Now, if you don't have a faceplate, or if you need extra faceplates, they're easy to get. I've got links for faceplates on my website. If you go over to my website, turnawoodbowl.com, and do /gear, you'll see a list of all the tools and gear that I recommend. And there's a whole section on faceplates. So I'm going to clean up the side of this blank. It doesn't need to be quite as large as it is, so I'm going to take it down and reduce the overall size, and at the same time clean up the edges. And then I'm going to grab my dividers. Now remember, when we're using the dividers, we're only touching the left side. That's the down force onto the tool rest. We never want the right side to touch. What we're doing with the right side is making sure that the right side is lined up right over the top of the little scribed line. That way we know we've scribed the distance properly. So I'm going to use the same straight scraper, and I'm going to scrape away the material inside this. Now, I'm making it a little narrower than the line I scribed, just in case it doesn't quite match up. That'll give me a little wiggle room. If I make this too wide initially, it's going to be difficult for the bowl to match up. So I'm going to stop frequently and see if this matches. Okay, it doesn't match yet, and that's exactly what I was thinking. So here you can see where I scribed, and I'm just going to remove a little more material, clean that up just a touch. I'm also going to need to make this a little deeper, but I want to make sure I get that size right first. It's still a little too small, which is fine. You're better off sneaking up on this size versus overcutting it and making it too wide. The reason I'm not going deep yet is that if I do go wide, then I can actually still make the next layer, the next depth, a little narrower, and that will help as well. So like I said, we're just going to sneak up on this. Now, interestingly enough, the 4-jaw chuck for wood turning didn't really come into existence, or wasn't really manufactured until like the 1980s. Prior to that, the only scroll chuck or 4-jaw chuck like we have today was used in the metal lathe or the metal milling industry. And essentially, the idea came from the metal mill and their chuck that they use. And there was an adaptation made, or a woodworking version made for the wood lathes that's mimicked the chucks that are on the metal mills or the metal lathes. All right, we got the depth, or we got the thickness set up properly now. We just need to make it a little bit deeper so that it will receive that tenon all the way to the bottom. Don't want to make it too deep. I don't want to have a hollow spot in the bottom of this. I want these two pieces to fit together almost like puzzle pieces. It's close. It needs to be a little bit deeper. This is a good time to just take your time and sneak up on the right dimensions here. You don't want to get aggressive and overdo it. If I make this too deep, there's going to be a hollow spot in there, and there won't be as much connection between the two pieces of wood. And we don't want that. We want a relatively snug fit without any play or any wiggling. If it wiggles, it's not going to turn true, or it's not going to turn in a smooth rotation. All right, that's looking really good. And it's got a snug fit, but it's not super tight. It's time to apply some glue to this. So I'm going to use a simple wood glue. This glue requires 24 hours to completely cure. Now, that's one of the only downsides for doing a bowl like this is you need the waste blocks. You need some extra material that you're going to turn away or waste, and you need to have some time because we need to let this glue set up. Now, if this were a 4-jaw chuck, I would be able to simply turn this blank around and mount it to the 4-jaw chuck and keep going. But because I have this glue block and I'm gluing these two pieces together, I'm going to apply some pressure with the tailstock here, and I'm going to let that glue cure and set up really well so that we can turn this tomorrow. So the next day, the glue's set up. Everything is in the same exact spot. It's looking good. We're ready to turn. Now I'm going to leave the tailstock there for right now for a little added support while I'm removing some of this top material. Part of the reason I'm leaving it there is I'm doing a 90-degree cut to the headstock. This is applying side pressure to that glue joint. If ever there's going to be a moment when this breaks free, it's when you're doing a cut that's in this angle, 90 degrees away from the joint. But because the tailstock is there, it's adding a lot of extra support. So you can get a little bit aggressive. I can use this moment and this opportunity with the tailstock to remove a good majority of this top layer of material very easily without much fear of it breaking free from the base. I'm going to take my time and establish the angle that I want the rim to be turned. You can see how I'm moving down into the bowl. That's the angle I like. That's just my personal preference. I like that particular flat angle top rim. Now I'm doing push cuts directly into the headstock. This is the best way to make cuts with a connection, with any kind of connection, because you're basically putting force directly into the headstock, and it's not going to be that big of a deal for the joint how the tenon is connected. Whether the tenon's glued to a waste block like we have now, or the tenon's attached to a chuck, either way you're putting stress on it if you're creating sideways cuts or 90-degree to the headstock cuts. So I'm establishing the thickness that I want this bowl to be, and then I'm going to turn the wall thickness. Now, what I'm doing here when I'm working that wall is I'm keeping the bevel of the bowl gouge lined up with the exterior of the bowl. Now remember, we've already established the exterior of this bowl. At no point now am I going to decide to change the exterior or the look of this bowl. Instead, I'm simply making the interior match the exterior. And the way I do that is I'm making the bevel of the bowl gouge parallel to the exterior of the bowl as I'm turning. If ever there's a time when you're turning a bowl that you're somewhat on autopilot, it's right now. Because I've already established the exterior of this and I'm just mirroring that, the interior, and methodically removing this core material as I work down the inside wall. Now you can see that I have the flute relatively open. The curve of the inside of this is relatively tight. So what I'm doing with that, when I have the flute open like I did, I'm making a very light pass, number one. And number two, what's happening is the curve of the front nose of the gouge can more easily ride that curved shape of the interior of the bowl. Again, these are headstock directed push cuts. So I'm pushing directly into the headstock. I'm essentially pushing the tenon down into that waste block. So this is not an aggressive cut for this mount or for any mount. Whenever you can do a push cut directly into the headstock, you're going to want to do that because you're going to have less chance of breaking the bowl off of its connection. So the interior is coming down pretty quickly. This poplar actually has some pretty neat pattern in it. There's a little yellow greenness to it in the interior. This is a tulip poplar that I harvested several years ago, and it stores very nicely. It doesn't seem to deteriorate like some species do. Of course, it has a well-known commercial appeal as well. This is something that you can purchase in the lumber yard or at a hardware store usually. It's difficult to get big chunks of it to turn bowls with from a commercial facility, but this is essentially the same wood, same species. It is a relatively soft wood, so you need to be careful not nicking it up, and it's very easy for that to happen. That's looking really nice. It's got some beautiful grain patterns in it. So I need to make a couple more passes. I want to sharpen my tool again. Always sharpen your tool right before the last couple passes so that you get a really nice clean cut surface, final surface. That way you'll have to do very little sanding and your bowl is going to be ready to go. I've got a course all about tool sharpening if you want to check that out. So I'm going to go again with the open flute. You can see how light I'm cutting. I'm not getting too aggressive with the depth of the cut. I am getting a little bit of burnish marks there in the corners because of the heel rubbing. One other thing that I could do is actually reduce the heel on this gouge so that it doesn't rub as much, but the other option is to make wide arcs that let the nose of the gouge ride that curve of the inside of the bowl. And all in all, that's looking good. Everything's going to sand very nicely. I do have a little bit of thickness in the bottom that I want to reduce. Now this, like I said, this piece is several years old and it is definitely equalized, meaning it's dry. It's not going to shift or alter very much. You want to be careful with that nub. You don't want to force it out because if you do, you'll leave a divot in the bottom of the bowl that will be very obvious. You just want to take your time, slow your pace down, especially at the bottom center. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and sand this up. I'm starting at 180 grit. I'm going to work from 180 to 220 to 320, and that'll give you a nice smooth final surface. Now I'm not going across the center of this with the lathe running, because that will create two low spots in the center which will make an obvious ridge, and we don't want that. So stop the lathe and hand sand that. Now I've got a video all about sanding bowls. You're going to want to check that out as well. Okay, so with the bowl sanded both outside and inside, it's time to remove our waste block and finish up this bowl. So I'm going to take the faceplate off first. Now keep in mind, this is the same faceplate. I'm reusing it at each connection here. You don't need more than one faceplate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a jam chuck. I'm going to use, again, another piece of scrap wood. I'm just going to quickly mark the center here. This doesn't have to be very precise. I'm going to eyeball right through the faceplate, line up that center, start the first screw, and then apply the second screw. Now what's really important with the faceplate is do not, under any circumstances, use drywall screws or any kind of narrow screw that is not a woodworking screw. Do yourself a favor, get a box of really good quality wood screws that are the right size for your faceplate. When you do that, you're going to have a secure connection. If you have a screw that's too narrow, your faceplate can shift around. You want the screw to fit relatively snug in that hole, and you want the thickness or the length of it to be about 7 threads sticking out the bottom of your faceplate, not longer and not shorter. But do not use drywall screws because drywall screws actually can snap. They're not designed to handle any kind of torque or side load like wood screws are. So with this piece of scrap wood, I'm actually converting it into a jam chuck. And in this particular instance, I'm going to shape it similar to the inside of our bowl. I'm going to clean up the sides and curve the side, the bottom corner, so that the bowl will fit right over the top of this. Just going to use a quick scrape cut to true that up. And because I just did that, it's turning true. I'm going to use a piece of scrap foam just to pad the inside of the bowl so it doesn't get all scratched up. And then we're going to pull the tailstock up. Now remember that little tick or the little indentation we made with the Forstner bit right there? We're going to use that to line up our tailstock and center it up right on that hole or that little mark that we made earlier. And by doing that, we've pretty much put the bowl back into a true position where it's turning very close to true. Now we need to excavate the tenon that we created on the bottom of this bowl. Now that tenon is going to turn into the foot of this bowl, but we have to get down to it first. It's actually kind of helpful. This species that I'm using, or this wood that I'm using for the waste wood, is a regular pine or fir lumber log. So it's got a slightly different color. So when I get through down to the poplar, there's going to be a color and texture difference. You can see it with the lathe turning. You know that you've gotten down to the tenon that's down there. Now, I have to admit, I probably made the tenon for this a little smaller than I needed to. You can make a wider, larger tenon. It's going to give you more connection and it's going to give you more to work with as far as shaping the foot of this bowl. But this will still work fine, and we'll work down to it and get it out here in just a second. So I'm just taking my time. I'm making relatively thin cuts because I'm not quite sure where that is. Again, these are push cuts into the headstock, so that's really, really helpful. There it is. You can see the color difference. The pine has a little more pink, kind of yellow red to it compared to the poplar. Now I'm going to use a shear scrape just to clean up that bottom edge. And then we'll take this down right to the top of that foot. I'm going to make sure this tailstock is snug. I want to snug it up at this point. Once that nub becomes narrow, I don't want to tighten the tailstock anymore. Because there's such a small piece of wood there, it could easily be crushed by the tailstock. And if you crush it, you can fold it or move it just a bit, and then it could cause the lathe to turn out of true, or the bowl to turn out of true. We don't want that. So the last tightening I just did is going to be my last. I'm not going to tighten this up anymore. And especially because this pine is soft, it can easily be crushed if I apply too much pressure with the tailstock. So I'm going to narrow the nub down. It's a good idea to do any finishing on the turning at this point before you get that nub too narrow. So I'm doing a scraping cut because I think we still have some material that's glued to the bottom of this bowl. We'll stop and take a look. Yeah, there's a little bit of the pine is still attached there. And there's some glue there as well. I'm going to get my spindle detail gouge and I'm going to get down there and shape this. The tenon being straight was important for gluing it to the waste block, but I'd rather have a slight inside angle to that just to give it a little design. And I'm going to just very lightly cut that corner out and at the same time remove that glue and the pine that's attached there. And then I'll come in with my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge and do a really light shear scrape to take all of that extra glue and material off completely and merge the bottom of this bowl and make it nice and curved. That's looking really good. There's still just a touch there. We'll be able to sand that off. I'm going to go through the different grits and sand that all smooth. I hope this shows you guys that you do not need a 4-jaw chuck to turn a bowl. And you're not limited. You can do pretty much anything that you can imagine with the bowl and the design using a glue block. And like I said earlier, there's a number of different ways to do this, different ways to do each of the steps. So this is not the only way by any means. If you see somebody else do this, there may be other techniques. Now, what I didn't do with this is I didn't put paper between my glue block and the bowl blank because I had no intention of chiseling this apart. A lot of times people will put paper between it. The paper is somewhat beneficial if you're going to put a chisel down between the glue block and the bowl blank and pop those two apart. But in this case, I'm just turning this glue block away completely, so that wasn't necessary. So I just glued the bowl blank directly to the glue stock or the waste stock. Now I'm using my spindle detail gouge to get down in here. Now keep in mind that nub is really soft material, even softer than the poplar that is the bowl. So there's a difference of textures and it's really tricky to get in here. So this is probably going to start loosening up on me. My jam chuck is relatively large and almost the same size as the inside of this bowl, so there's a poor chance that the bowl will go flying, but I don't want to damage the bowl either. So I'm going to apply pressure and turn the lathe off, and it did break loose there, but it didn't get too far. And I just need to sand that nub down. Now I'm going to apply some tried and true Danish oil. This is pure linseed oil for a quick finish. It's a very thin coat is all you need. I've got a little dinky piece of scrap t-shirt that's about a 1-inch square. That being soaked in the Danish oil is enough to coat the entire bowl. You don't need much. If you can see the finish on it, you have enough. And then we let this sit for about 10 minutes, then I'll wipe off any excess and then let that cure completely before applying another coat. And then it'll build up and create a really nice finish. This is a pretty nice bowl. I'm pretty happy with it. And it's not that complicated using a glue block and turning a bowl without a 4-jaw chuck. I mean, look at that. That's fantastic. And it's got a great design, great shape. I wasn't limited. I could get into all the different angles and turn any shape I wanted. And I think it turned out really nice. So here it is. I think this turned out really nice. I'm very happy with it. What's really exciting is this was made without using a 4-jaw chuck. Now, if you've looked at pricing, you know 4-jaw chucks are not cheap. And if you're just starting out turning, or if you just got a lathe and you don't know if you want to turn bowls, this is a great technique to use to find out if you want to turn bowls. Now, it's going to take a little bit more time. You're going to need to be patient. You need to let that glue dry overnight and set up. You're going to need some scrap wood to use as well. But essentially, you can do everything with the faceplate that came with your lathe. And again, if you don't have a faceplate, you can purchase these very, very cheap compared to buying a 4-jaw chuck. All right, guys, I hope you've liked this video. If you have, do me a favor, leave a comment below and click that like button. If you click that like button, it helps out this channel, helps the video, helps everything out, and I appreciate and thank you for doing that. Thank you very much. Also, be sure to check out my website, turnawoodbowl.com. Over there, I've got everything you need to know about turning wood bowls, and I have online courses that are going to help you learn wood bowl turning very quickly, and you can enjoy doing turnings like this in no time. All right, guys. As always, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, happy turning.